It may come as a surprise to most of you that building a small PC is actually more difficult than building a standard size ATX system. It's just more difficult to work in smaller places. It's more difficult to get the same kind of compute power in smaller spaces as well. As a result, you've seen some system builders like Digital Storm and case vendors like Bitphoenix release unique and different designs trying to capture that mini ITX and small form factor market. EVGA is entering it now with the Hadron Air. This is the EVGA Hadron Air Mini ITX. It's a steel chassis, and the Air designation it just is there because they're going to release another version in the future that's more based towards water cooling, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. And because this is from EVGA, a system or a vendor rather that knows enthusiasts and know what PC gamers really want, you have certain expectations for it, right? So this case has features that it can support full-size graphics cards, NVIDIA GeForce GTX Titan, 780 Ti. You know, you'll be able to put some of the high-end AMD cards in there, but it's specifically designed for EVGA's own graphics cards and thus the GeForce ones. And we have a Titan in this system currently, and it works perfectly. You'll also have, you can support any mini ITX motherboard. We happen to have the EVGA Z87 Stinger. That's one of their own motherboards as well. They've kind of built an entire ecosystem around this platform. It's interesting. They sell a slot loading optical drive for this case. They sell a cooler that is meant for mini ITX form factors in this particular case as well. But it's an interesting kind of ecosystem that they built around the Hadron. In terms of, if we just look at the case itself, the front of it is very clean. I like it. It's a gloss finish, gloss black, one single button. It will get fingerprints on it, but I guess don't touch the front of your case too often. You've got ventilation up front. It comes with 2 fans up top. There's ventilation at the bottom, but there are no fans at the bottom. If we turn to this side, you'll actually be able to see that we have some air intake here. You've got 2 USB 3.0 ports as well as your audio input and output. And then this is your slot loading optical drive bay. So it's on the side of the case, which I like. It kind of cleans up the front of the design. On the back, you can see here our mini ITX motherboard is installed. We have grommets here for water cooling, although it's not really recommended that you have water cooling in this design. There's no space inside the case for even a self-contained water cooling kit, let alone individual reservoirs and radiators. So if that's something you're doing, that's for external. If you happen to have an external unit that you want to use with this case, you can do that. We've got a dual slot graphics card installed, and we have a power supply down here that is included with the case. It's a 1U power supply, which normally is the biggest aggravator for us when it comes to these small form factor designs. Because of this tiny little fan, they tend to be very loud. This is a 500 watt 80 plus gold unit that is not loud. Very surprisingly, not loud at all. And it's the first time we've had a power supply at this size in this form factor that actually worked very well. And then on this side, you have the window to the main components on the system, and the window it pretty much shows everything that you have inside the design. So if you have cable clutter, if you have anything like that going on, they're definitely going to be able to see it. So let's go ahead and remove the window here, just a couple of thumb screws for that. And I'll walk you through some of the features and capabilities that this case has. We do have in the full story on PCPer.com, we have a lot of pictures of the installation process, and we'll have some other comments from myself and Ken, who we've actually built a couple of systems in this case over the last couple of months. Probably the most difficult part of building a mini ITX system is the actual installation of the components into the case. You can see here that we have our GTX Titan graphics card, but that will support anything up to like a 780 Ti, a standard NVIDIA GeForce form factors. We've got our mini ITX motherboard, in this case the EVGA Z87 Stinger. We have a 4770 processor with, we're using the stock Intel heatsink, and then we've got room for your hard drives and optical drive in here. Now, installing the motherboard is pretty straightforward. That's usually your first step. Everything else will be out of the case. Put the motherboard in, screw it down like normal, you're ready to go. Now, the next steps after that can get pretty complicated because, as you can see, if you look at our graphics card, from the end of the graphics card to the front of the case, you only have about 1 inch worth of space. So it gets pretty crowded and it gets complicated when you have to decide, are you going to route the ATX power cable first and then install the graphics card? You want to install the graphics card and then move the cable around it. Because the cables that come out of this power supply down here are relatively short, you don't have a lot of wiggle room, right? But it's, they need to be short so you don't have a ton of extra slack that you're trying to route and hide inside a very, very small case. You can see you have our USB 3 front panel, our audio front panel connections. Those are a little bit harder to get to than they would normally be in kind of your standard ATX size case. You do not have room for any kind of self-contained water cooler on this heatsink. For your heatsink option, you can see up top, you've got 220 millimeter fans there. So you have a lot of airflow in this design. They're drawing air out in their default position, but you cannot install, there's not enough room to install a radiator there or on this side. So you are limited to standard heatsink fan combinations, or unless you use these grommets out the back for some kind of external water cooling option. There are still heatsinks that will fit in here. EVGA actually sells one on their own that's $50 or so that is made to work with this specific case design. The other kind of problematic issue we had was with our storage, right? So the optical bay, the optical drive actually has a little tray that will slide down into the front here. That's not that big of an issue. The problem is that these two drive sleds, which will support 3.5-inch or 2.5-inch drives, hard drives, you have to bring the cables up front. You can see we have our SATA and data cable up here. You can't run them through the back, and you can't even run the cables through the back and up and install them over here, right? They kind of have to wrap around this side, which means you're going to have a little bit more cable clutter than I would like. It's one of the nice things, especially if you have a system that is always on display with a window, is that all the cables for your hard drives and your optical drives kind of go out the other side that are on the back that would normally be on the other side of these components for your normal case. But in this design, they're up front. So you should do a better job than we are showcasing here in terms of taking your ATX cable, your data cable, your power cable, kind of bundling them up, pushing them a little bit further back, attaching them to this drive cage if you can. The problem is that you just don't have a ton of space anywhere to do anything really unique or different like that. So it can be crowded. There are complications, to be sure. You might want to get some shorter memory modules. We're using these Corsair Vengeance DIMMs, but they're relatively tall. So if we wanted to get a larger heatsink in there, you would have to maybe get something a little lower profile. But I think most of these problems that we're talking about and describing for Mini ITX systems are common amongst almost all Mini ITX cases. The fact that we can get a GTX Titan in here with a power supply that can provide enough juice for it, and we can get a 4770K and a Z87 board, and you can run, 2 hard drives or an SSD and a hard drive plus an optical drive inside this tiny case is still pretty impressive. So that's the EVGA Hadron Air case in a nutshell. You can get a ton of compute power, top-level components. I don't recommend anybody buy a GTX Titan really anymore for gaming, but a 780 Ti if you want, or 780 or 770, you can fit just about any graphics card in there. You can even go AMD if you want. Just make sure you're checking the length of the card versus the maximum length of supported card on this. Now, it's a great case. It has a couple of little quirks that we're not super happy about, and it's a little bit on the expensive side. Most of these Mini ITX high-end cases are like that. This is $189 currently. That does include the case, no optical drive or anything like that, but it does include the 500-watt power supply. So if you build that into it, it's not a rip-off or anything like that. It's just people might balk a little bit at spending $189 on a case, especially one that is so small. But remember what I said, sometimes it's more complicated and more expensive to build a small PC than it is your normal standard size PC. Other accessories, like I said, they have the optical drive. That'll be another $50 if you want to use their brand. They have a heatsink if you want to use theirs. That's another $50 as well. They are going to release another version, I think sometime in 2014, called the Hadron Hydro, that I think will support maybe self-contained water cooling and maybe just custom water cooling. Maybe it'll be a little bit larger, a little bit taller in some areas, I think. But for users that are looking to build that SteamOS box, or they just want a small form factor gaming PC that they can put on their desk, will remain pretty quiet, which this does, which I think is a surprise for compared to a lot of the Mini ITX cases and systems we have gotten in. So it's a good little build. I would recommend it if you're looking to build a tiny PC. This is the EVGA Hadron Air Mini ITX case.